This is a summary of the setup for the Gulf Strike simulation. This is the strategic map. A couple of issues. The Americans are required to deploy on the strategic map. It's recommended they deploy south of Diego Garcia. The Soviet fleet is required to deploy at a port, but they don't have to be in a port, just on a port hex. You don't want to be have the import status, otherwise the Soviet fleet becomes detected. The Soviets need to put a premium on protecting their assets and interfering with American supply lines into the Persian Gulf later, because in general there's some critical weaknesses. British and American submarines have both twice the detection capability and twice the electronic countermeasures capability as their Soviet counterparts, which makes them very powerful. They're also American and even Russian submarines are more effective at detecting surface vessels than airborne early warning aircraft. So submarines are a very important asset. They're difficult to detect, and in the case of the American and British submarines, they're menacing killers. So the Soviets should deploy in a concentrated fashion to protect their submarines using their ships, protecting their ships by using their own submarines against American submarines, and getting benefiting to some extent from air cover from the units in the democratic Yemen and in Yemen. The Soviets also have their Tupolev backfire bombers deployed in Afghanistan. These should be relocated to Soviet airspace as soon as possible. During the Cold War, the Soviets had a fifth arm, which was air defense. And the air defense chart makes it very expensive and costly for the Americans to intervene using bombers into Soviet airspace. And if those Tupolevs are not moved on the first turn, the B-52s may very well come along and strike them down. The Israeli Air Force, there's 3 units. There's a 1% chance per turn that the Israelis will be activated. They have an 8 hex range maximum, so they can reach out into parts of Saudi Arabia, and they can reach heavily into Iraq. So they're an important American asset for intervention in Iraq. A major issue for the Soviets is they should not deploy on the operational map in the Persian Gulf, because of the scale effects are such that where on the strategic map the Soviet air defense can interact, can shoot at American air systems that are bringing anti-ship missiles against Soviet targets. On the operational map, Soviet air defense has less range than American anti-ship missiles, which means the Americans can, with impunity, destroy the Soviet Navy. So the Soviets should never deploy on the operational map. What I want to do now is go through in a clockwork fashion the different likely deployments and issues for each of the players. Starting up here in the Caucasus, there are really 2 attacking forces. You've got forces coming from Armenia headed towards Tabriz, and a second army, essentially a corps, that would be heading down the Caspian coast on their way to Tehran. Both of these are going to need air cover. Both are going to need supply depots to be set up, which are then vulnerable to special forces and airstrikes. So they need to be well protected by air defense. Equally, from the Central Asian front, you have a Soviet army, one component of which should be sent after Tehran, and another component of which should be sent into the eastern interior of Iran to eventually link up with Soviet airborne elements that land at the Straits of Hormuz. And it's a very difficult trek, because the Soviets have to set up an air attack and special forces resistance supply network, which may require breaking down some divisions into their brigades to provide garrisons for those depots. The Soviets also have assets. They have 2 divisions in Afghanistan, which can intervene also to relieve Soviet airborne soldiers that land at the Straits of Hormuz. The issue here is that there's a 10% chance per turn that the Pakistanis will intervene, and the Pakistani corps here is substantially strong. It could have a significant effect on stopping a Soviet advance into Iran. Now, going now to the Persian Gulf, the Soviets, the Iranians have occupied one of the victory hexes, Kay's Island and Bandar Abbas. The Omani Special Forces Battalion has occupied this airfield, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi have been occupied by the United Arab Emirates. These are the 5 hexes that need to be occupied. in order to control the Straits of Hormuz. The Omani battalion is out of supply, but because it's a battalion, it cannot be further reduced. So, but what's going to have to happen is the Omani are going to have to come in on this strategic hex, and they're going to have to build a supply depot network that puts this emplacement on into supply. The general setup for the Qatari, the Bahraini, the Kuwaitis, and the Saudis should be to stack all of their assets on their one and only supply sources, which is Abu Dhabi, Doha, Al Manama, Riyadh, and Kuwait City. If those countries lose those cities, they're effectively out of play. So it's important to garrison them heavily. Here are the Iraqi deployment. It's sort of arbitrary, but the Iraqis have supplies at An-Nasiriyah, but they don't have any coming out of Basra. Basra is not a supply source. So the Iraqis have to build a network of supply depots that supplies the units at the front that are pushing to take Ahvaz and Abadan in Iran. This is a problem because if the Israelis come into play, or if the substantial Iranian Air Force comes into play, they can blow up these depots. In this particular instance, I've put a lot of airfields at Basra, and I've put a substantial concentration of Iraqi air forces at Basra to provide close air support because they don't have a great deal of range. I also have some Iraqi forces here that will try to take Kuwait City, and the Saudis have deployed those forces that are not the National Guard, who have elite status in protecting Riyadh. These will be conducting forward defense with the Kuwaitis against the Soviet move against Kuwait. And I have lesser Soviet garrisons in the north protecting Mosul, Kirkuk, Baghdad, and I've got an armored unit here threatening Kermanshah and Hamadan. Now for the general Iranian setup, each of the cities gets a Basij division, and these got reinforced later on. And their air force has been deployed in depth in places like Shiraz and Asfahan because the Soviets will quickly overrun the north. I have left helicopters in the north to provide close support. Now the Iranian, the bulk of their ground forces were deployed right up against the border with Azerbaijan, and that may not be a good idea because the Soviets, if they nerve gas in the first few turns, will almost annihilate that force. And I've deployed some forces, Iranian forces around Tehran, 2 divisions, and some forces to protect Abadan and Ahvaz. But that's really up to the Iranian player, whether they want to confront the Soviets right on the border or they want to draw them in a bit and then expose Soviet supply lines to American air power.